Yes, I can.
Could you hear Bob Ryder?
Yes, yep.
Okay, good. How are you doing? We're sorry to interrupt your week with family.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
Okay. So
Hi, Heather.
everybody knows the drill, right? Okay. Well, what I'm going to do is start out by reading this script that I sent you guys. I hope I didn't say anything that any of you found offensive. I don't think I
Hey, Bob,
did.
let me interrupt. Bob, I don't see Dale on my screen.
Oh, you're right. Where is Dale?
I was going to say.
I don't know. I tried calling Dale. I left a message for Dale and sent him an email. So I don't know where Dale is. But I don't think we're going to be able to wait at this point. So let me see, which questions do we have Dale asking?
Bob, shall I try calling him again myself?
Yeah, go ahead and call him on your cell.
I gotta find one first.
He was going to ask about the Skigimog warm water species and about electroshocking Elk Lake.
Okay.
Yeah, so as long as it shows recording up there,
Okay, I'm
you're
good.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Maybe we could just go ahead and start, Bob, and then Dale's done. And
This, yeah, and if he for some reason is unable to join us, then we can. I will.
well, I can ask the questions, or you can just follow yours, and you can ask them.
Yeah.
Oh, Dale just jumped in, guys.
Oh, Dale's
I'm
with us.
here. I'm
Oh.
here.
Okay, and so is Pat. Okay, and Pat Pat is also a serious fisherman. He has a really nice boat, in case anybody was wondering. That's only a year old. I'm not seeing the faces of Pat or Dale.
Yeah, I am not. Let's see, I have my share screen. Let's see, video. Ah!
There you are. And Pat?
Lower left-hand corner was for some reason, mine was off.
Okay. Pat, can you hear us?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine. We just can't see you.
Well, I'll keep working on this.
Okay.
I'll keep working on my picture.
Look
No,
in the
it's-
lower left-hand corner, Pat. It says video, and mine had an X through it.
Thank you. That button was there for a moment. Now that little red cross is gone, so I'll figure it out. Don't let me hold anything up. Thank you.
Put your pointer on it and go crazy.
Okay, well, if everybody's ready, I am going to start the formal part of this that hopefully we'll get 1,000 web hits on in the first 2 days. So here we go. Welcome to the first of what your Elk Skigimog Lakes Association Board hopes will grow into a series of presentations and interviews with people who bring insights to issues of interest and concern to ESLA members, riparians, and occasional visitors to our website, elk-skigimog.org. In a year when the pandemic has forced the ESLA board to cancel our annual June membership meeting, as well as our once in a month, it's a sure thing, Friday night gatherings at Twisted Fish Gallery, we see this as a new opportunity to connect. Today, we're talking with Heather Hettinger, the DNR's fisheries management biologist for our region. Heather made the critical decision to resume trout planting, specifically brown trout, on Elk Lake after a lapse of more than a decade. Heather grew up in Kent City, north of Grand Rapids, and began fishing as a young child at a family cottage in Lake County. That's also where she raised bugs, tadpoles, and minnows in the mayonnaise jars her grandmother saved for the little girl fascinated with fish and other critters. Today, Heather has undergraduate and graduate degrees in biology with a focus on fisheries management from Lake Superior State University and the University of Nebraska. She has worked for the DNR since college. Heather's love for fishing also apparently had something to do with her choice of a spouse. Her husband, Chris, is a river guide and former Lake Michigan charter boat operator. Heather also has an affinity for Theodore Roosevelt, the sportsman president. Her emails end with this quote from Teddy: "Far and away the best prize that life has to offer is the chance to work hard at something worth doing." Our panelists today are Ken Krentz, who heads ESLA's fishing group and is a retired General Motors engineer. Ken is passionate about all things fishing, especially fly fishing, whether in the Rapid River or the Western United States. His smile was a mile wide as he watched thousands of brown trout pumped into Lake Michigan the last few years from DNR hatchery trucks. Dale Claude-Pierre, a retired executive with Ford Motor Company, headed ESLA's environmental committee for many years and has led numerous efforts to keep our waters clean, especially of aquatic invasives. Dale travels to New Zealand every winter to enjoy arguably the best fly fishing in the world. Bob Ryder, a retired fisheries biologist, is a member of ESLA's environmental committee and is on the board of the Watershed Center, Grand Traverse Bay. Bob has an advanced degree in fisheries biology as well as an MBA. Bob's interest in freshwater lake biology began in boyhood at a family cottage in New Hampshire and grew as a master's candidate at the University of Michigan. Sadly, he does not fish. I'm Bob Campbell, your moderator, and ESLA's vice president. I worked at the Detroit Free Press as an editor and reporter for 30 years before moving to Skegumog Lake with my wife Ruth in 2013. My license plate reads, "I fish." The second I is actually a 1. Somebody already had "I fish." So we're going to follow with question and answer format and begin today's questions with Ken.
Hi, Heather. Let's start by talking about the Elk Lake trout plantings that Bob mentioned.
Sure.
DNR decided here a few years ago to begin planting trout in Elk Lake again after a little bit of time when none were planted. Can you just tell us how that works and what your expectations are for planting those fish there? Do you expect them to reproduce and so forth? And also a little bit about the cost of that.
Sure. So the idea kind of first came to me. There were about, I think, collectively about a dozen folks from Elk Lake who, every time they would pop into the office or they would see me at a sport show or such, they would bring up the topic of, hey, why don't we stock anything in Elk Lake anymore? We used to have this tremendous brown trout fishery. We're kind of tired of fishing for lake trout. There's a few rainbow trout around, but we really need, something additional to fish for too. And so I started doing some research and looking at old files as to maybe why we cut those trout stockings, kind of what the background was. To make a very long story short, part of the reason that we kind of stopped stocking fish, it was twofold. Number one, we had some strains in our hatchery system that we were using that had become kind of overly domesticated and they weren't performing well. When we did away with those strains of fish, we cut back our stocking tremendously. The second thing was we had done a study in the early 2000s on Elk Lake where we looked at the rainbow trout that we stocked. We did a paired comparison study where we stocked the Eagle Lake strain rainbows and we stocked steelhead to see which species, or which strain did better. Long story short, the steelhead did better, and we saw that in every lake that we did the competition with. However, we don't have enough steelhead in our hatchery system to stock steelhead in inland lakes and do Lake Michigan stocking as well. So we're not able to stock steelhead, random cat. We're not able to stock steelhead in most of these systems. The thing that we discovered in Elk Lake was our creel clerk was having a really hard time finding people that were even fishing. And some of the folks who were fishing would kind of intentionally avoid the creel clerk, and maybe that was because they didn't want people to know, where they were fishing specifically or what they were catching, but at any rate, they were being very, very secretive. So our angler catch rates were absolutely terrible. As a result, we decided to, let me get rid of this cat here. We decided to stop stocking trout completely because the effort wasn't there. And Ken, you kind of mentioned the cost. We take that into huge considerations whenever we stock fish because we're spending public dollars. So the decision was made to kind of cut fish, and that was in about, I believe it was like 2008. So fast forward, one big thing we're kind of doing across the state of Michigan right now is that we are evaluating our Great Lakes brown trout plants. Great Lakes browns are a little bit tougher game than inland browns because they're hugely weather dependent. So it's a small boat fishery. And when you have winters like we do in Michigan, where the tail end of winter and start of spring is pretty unpredictable, it's really tough to get small boats out into the Great Lakes. So we're seeing interest dwindle in those Great Lakes brown trout stocking locations. We've narrowed it down to just a couple of locations that work well. We've cut the others. What that did was free up brown trout in our hatchery system. So in talking to a few people around the lake, Bob, Ken, a few other folks, I realized that there was an interest in another species. We had brown trout available, and that was kind of where we landed on brown trout. I knew it was going to be a tough sell to get people within Fish Division to go with rainbow trout, with what the experience we'd had in the past. The other thing with that is some of the folks that are fishing Elk Lake on a hugely regular basis are doing very well on wild rainbow trout. So it's kind of one of those things. The Rapid River system is producing wild rainbows. All of our very small tributaries to Elk Lake have wild rainbows in them. So that's working in the background. We didn't want to mess with that too much. We had the opportunity to grab those brown trout, so we did. What we're doing is 40,000 brown trout annually into Elk Lake. That breaks down to roughly 5.2 fish per acre. It costs us about $55,000 a year to do that stocking. And that's everything. That's egg to lake, basically. That's spawning our adult broodstock in the hatchery. That's the cost of raising those fish to the appropriate stocking size. It's the cost of loading them on the truck and paying the driver to bring them to you guys. So it is a little bit of an investment. And so if anglers are catching browns, I'd definitely like to hear about it. We started stocking in 2018. And the first batch of fish that we put in were fall fingerlings. So they're smaller than what we typically stock. We typically stock a spring yearling, which is roughly about 6 to 8 inches. These fall fingerlings are typically right around 4 or 5 inches. So they started a little bit behind the game. So I anticipate that that first batch of fish is really going to start recruiting to the fishery next year. We may see a few inadvertent fish caught this fall that are hatchery products, but really next year is when we should start seeing those fish show up.
Okay, good. Any expectation they'll reproduce or not?
Some will to a point, but we think about the systems. Most of the fish that we have are going to be river spawners, just based on the genetic stock that we use. We already have a bunch of brown trout spawning, in the Rapid River, in some of the smaller tributaries to Elk, to Torch, that sort of thing. So the capability is there, but most of the brown trout that are produced out of the Rapid River either choose to stay river residents, or if they do leave, they seem to want to hang out and torch more than they do in elk. So I suspect we're not going to get a ton of natural reproduction out of those fish, and I'm not really banking on it to support Elk Lake. I think really the fish that we stock are the ones that are going to, stay put and create the fishery.
Okay, good. Next topic is bass tournaments, bass fishing tournaments. We see bass fishing tournaments happening on the lake periodically, and ESLA gets questions about about bass tournaments, mostly from non-fishermen, people who aren't aware. So can you just talk real briefly about how the bass tournaments work, and then any effects you think it might have on the resident population?
Sure. So bass tournaments in Michigan are they're a long-standing thing. It's a pretty popular activity. We've had we've had groups that have kind of created their own tournament system for a very, very long time across the state, since the late 60s, early 70s. So it's not a new thing by any stretch. And actually, I think tournament effort comparatively is down now versus maybe in the late 80s, early 90s. I know my dad fished bass circuits a lot. He also worked for General Motors, and that was a big thing. With a lot of these factories and industries, they'd have, kind of localized tournament trails, if you will. So I think we're kind of in a lull part comparatively to what we used to see for tournaments. But nowadays in the state of Michigan, bass tournaments have to be registered through the department. If you're having a bass tournament, and actually we've expanded it to a couple of other species as well. If you're having a tournament, you have to register with Fish Division. And what that does is it allows us to kind of monitor where the bulk of these types of activities are happening. We can, and actually you guys can go and take a look at this as well. You can actually go to our website and look up tournaments, and you can see our reports through time as to what these tournament directors have reported to us. So if you're a tournament director, you're the one who's responsible for going in and registering the tournament. We require that you provide us with the number of boats you anticipate, the number of anglers you anticipate, the body of water, the time frame and such. And then we ask you to give some reporting details. So at the end of the season, you guys hang on one second. Okay, so at the end of the tournament season, folks are required to provide us with kind of the finalized details as to how many people actually participated, how many boats were actually there, how many fish were caught and released, I think average weights too. So so that we've got all that information, we put it into a report type format, and you guys can actually go on the website and take a look at that at the end of every year. I don't know that the 2019 report is up there, but 2016 through 2018 is up there and available for people to read. Bass tournaments kind of are a tough perception for folks, especially if people don't fish. What people see is a lot of noisy go fast boats that are zooming from one end to the lake to the other. And so it gives people kind of a weird perception of fishing. Bass tournaments, the practice itself, there's a ton of options nowadays when it comes to bass tournaments. Typically and historically, a bass tournament has been, people are allowed to fish, all over, let's say in the chain there, maybe they have to launch an elk, but they can fish elk, they can fish skeggamog, they can fish torch. The weigh-in is at one centralized location. All the fish are brought to that location and subsequently released at that location. We're seeing bass tournaments switch to a different format now sometimes, where either they are requiring people to take those fish back to the locations that they came from, or at least the lake that they caught their fish in, or they're doing kind of catch and release style tournaments where the format is based on length. So you're given an official measuring board, you're given a medallion or some kind of token to put in that picture you take a picture of every fish that you catch. And then these tournaments are decided upon by total length. So bass tournaments are kind of starting to evolve. There's a lot of concern from folks with tournaments that occur during bass spawning and nesting season, where you're potentially taking a male who's guarding eggs or newly hatched fish, and you're removing that fish not only from its core area, but you're maybe moving it to an entirely different lake, or you're moving it 12 miles down the shoreline. We do see some pretty negative impacts from that. There's been a number of studies. We had some students at MSU do some work a number of years ago that looked at that issue specifically and found that it's an issue for individual nests, obviously, because you have egg predators that come in pretty quickly. But collectively, if you look at a lake as a whole, the effects aren't enough to be significantly impacting the population.
Okay, good. Anything else about hooking injury? That's always a thought. You hook a fish, you release it,
Yep.
and what's the survival rate?
It depends across the species, or it depends which species you're dealing with, for one thing. And it depends on the time of year that the fish is being caught. Bass are a little bit more resilient. Bass have tougher bony structures in their face to begin with. So they're less prone to mouth-related injuries from the hook itself. A lot of hooking mortality when it comes to fishing has to deal with temperature and degassing within the fish's system. Bass in general, in the summertime when we would see those issues with a lot of species, they're hanging out in shallower, more oxygen-deprived water anyway. So their ability to take on gas and get rid of gas is a little bit different than, say, something you're hooking down deep in cold water like a lake trout. So when people are catching bass deep, it's typically cooler water. And when people are catching fish in close, it tends to be warmer water. So we don't see a ton of issues with hooking mortality. Handling can be a different story, especially if you're keeping fish in a live well for an extended period of time and surface waters are pretty warm. If you're not doing other measures to keep that water cool, we do see some mortality based on handling and then bad water temperature in live wells.
Okay, good. Let's change bodies of water here and talk about the Rapid River for a minute.
Sure.
A couple of things. DNR planted some Atlantic salmon this spring. Talk a little bit about that. And then secondly, you did some surveys in the past, some fish surveys, and you're planning to do more. Can you just briefly talk about that, the history and what's up in the future?
Yep. So we were able to get yearling Atlantic salmon for Torch Lake this year, which is the first time that's happened in a long time. The yearlings are preferred. They're the larger of our stock product. They do better. They're less prone to predation. Most of our Atlantic salmon have been going to Lake Huron for, I would say, the past 10 years. We've been receiving fall fingerlings for Torch Lake, and we have not seen the survival that we've really wanted to. So I've kind of been pushing really hard to make sure that we get yearlings back over here and get this fishery back up to what it used to be. And that actually came to fruition this year. We had enough that I was actually able to try to do a little bit of an experiment. So we were able to stock 16,000 at Alden in Torch Lake. We were able to stock 15,000 over at Torch Lake Village. And then I took another 8,000 and stocked them in the Rapid River up at Dundas Road. The reason for that was I want to try and see if we can get any natural reproduction out of those fish. And Atlantic salmon are a species where they like velocity and they like gradient. So which the Rapid River has a ton of. They also, in order to get them to come back there and spawn, they need to imprint. So the higher you put a fish in a river system, and the longer it has to go to get out of that river system, the better it imprints on that water. Fish develop, like a taste essentially, or a smell for whichever body of water they smolt out in. And smoltification is basically the process of a trout or salmon that's migratory, leaving the river system that it was hatched in and going out into the bigger body of water that it's going to spend most of its life in. So as those fish are smolting out, they're going to travel down the rapid river. They won't stay long. They're going to travel out the rapid river, develop a taste for that river, and hopefully in the fall, or a couple of falls down the road when they're ready to spawn, they'll key in on that water and come back up there. We have documented Atlantic salmon as far up as the Rug Dam in multiple years when we've had robust numbers of adult Atlantic salmon around. But with the numbers in the lake declining, we've seen that go down, and I have not been able to successfully document any natural reproduction up there so far. So we're looking to kind of pin that down and see if that is in fact happening. And even if it's not, having those fish return up the rapid river, even if they don't spawn successfully, we reach another goal by creating a fall fishery in a spot that does have a little bit of a fall fishery to begin with, but this could add a little bit more diversity to that fishery.
Okay, do you think there will be any negative impacts on the native browns and brookies and rainbow trout?
There really shouldn't be. As I mentioned, those young Atlantic salmon, they are not going to spend a ton of time. Once we stock them, they're not going to spend a ton of time in that river system. If we do get natural reproduction, those fish would spend about 1.5 years in the river. So they would compete with fish of the same age. They would compete with young brown trout, and they would compete with young steelhead simply for like plankton type resources and habitat. Luckily, the rapid is pretty habitat rich. It flows through a pretty nice watershed where we've got good productivity. So bugs and plankton are fairly abundant in there. There'll be a little bit of competition, and that's kind of why I did a fairly low number of fish. Even if we are getting any natural reproduction, that number is probably fairly low as well. So we shouldn't see, while there will be some competition, we shouldn't see enough to disrupt the populations of fish that are already residents to the rapid.
Okay, good. Next, I think Bob Reeder has some questions.
Hey, let me jump in here just for a second. Bob, this seems like, given what Heather's talking about right now, an appropriate time to throw in the forage question you were going to ask.
Okay, yep. Basically, has there been any, well, what is the status of the forage fish in really both lakes, Heather, elk and skeegamog, and then is that sufficient to support the current predator species and any potential stocking in the future?
Yep. So great question. So we did a survey in Torch Lake a couple of years ago. And one of the components that we always do in our surveys is we set very fine mesh nets, specifically looking for forage-based type species. So in Torch, for example, we have things like emerald shiners, young cisco, young whitefish, creek chubs, sand shiners, mimic shiners, central mud minnows. So there's a wide variety of minnow species, and those carry into both lake, all those lakes in the chain. We're lucky in the respect that we've got a pretty big flow through system there. So you've constantly got nutrients moving through the system. We had planned, well, I shouldn't get too far ahead because I know this is a question for later, but when we do survey Elk Lake, we'll get in there and we'll do the same thing, and we'll do a number of net sets that are geared toward looking at those smaller fish and getting a good idea of what the species richness kind of is in Elk Lake specifically. But there's no indication right now that what we're seeing in Elk Lake is anything different than what we're seeing in Torch Lake. And so based on what we've seen in surveys, what we've seen in stomach contents, a lot of the fishing guides and regular anglers that fish on elk will keep me kind of in the loop as to what they're seeing in stomach contents and those sorts of things. So what we're seeing anecdotally doesn't seem to be any kind of issue. Even we've got a fair amount of predators in those systems. Elk, you're looking at lake trout, you're looking at the rainbows and the brown trout, bass in particular. Most of our predators don't completely overlap in niches. I mean, even brown trout and rainbow trout, there's pretty significant portions of the year where they're not living in the same areas of the lake. We know that our lake trout are a super, super deep species. They're down there concentrating on a completely different diet than, say, brown trout or rainbow trout is. And they're concentrating on a different diet than what a smallmouth is. So we have a pretty heavy predator load in Elk Lake, in Skagamog Lake, in Torch Lake, but it's a pretty balanced predator load in the sense that they're not all foraging on the same species or in the same locations at the same time.
Okay. Well, then you kind of, that leads me into my next question about what is the status of the remnant lake trout in Elk Lake, since you mentioned that,
Yep.
and whether they can be supported.
Yeah, so it's definitely, for the specifics, it's definitely a question for Jory Jonas out of our Charlevoix Research Station. She's the one who did the effort and is coordinating the data for the lake trout survey that most of us are familiar with. I will say, kind of roughly, what we did, two big takeaways from that were that we don't fully understand how those fish are spawning. We know that they're deep water spawners. Their substrate choices for spawning are very interesting. It's a lot of clay in the bottom of elk, and it's weird to think that that's where lake trout are choosing to spawn and be successful. We aren't sure how successful they are. For a while there, Jory had a number of tagged fish roaming around the system, and anglers were catching untagged fish. So we kind of thought that the population was a little bit potentially bigger than we had initially thought. It's tough. I worked with Jory a couple times to run those gill nets and get that survey work done. And man, those fish are tough to catch. You're running, gill nets down at 200 feet. It's a tough deal. So there's the biggest takeaway is we still have a lot of unknowns, and Jory's still working on looking at some of the data. She did a lot of work with what we call morphometry, which is the fish's shape and how different fish shapes kind of relate genetically and such. So I know she's still pulling through some of that data. I know she's got some interest in expanding that survey work into Torch Lake and comparing the two even. And trying to kind of look at movements and how those two populations are related to each other. So it's kind of an ongoing project still. And the specifics are that's really a Jory question, but it's definitely a really interesting population of lake trout, hugely different from anything else that we see in the state. And we're not sure on the numbers. Like I said, at first there was some thought that maybe we were dealing with more fish than we thought we were. And now as tag returns start coming in and stuff, I think we're back to the realization that population isn't hugely robust. It's doing well. We're seeing tagged fish get caught. We're seeing younger, smaller fish get caught. But there's still a lot of unknowns with that species of trout. At this point in time, I don't know that we would really be able to use them as a brood stock source for a couple of reasons. Number one, we don't want to compromise what's going on in Elk Lake. And number two, with everything that's going on out in Lake Michigan with stocking other species, reducing lake trout stockings across the lake and Chinook stockings and such, I don't know that there's a need for them at this point. There could be in the future. They're a really unique strain. They're a strain that should be in Lake Michigan to begin with. So maybe there's some value down the road, but I think right now, any kind of plans to use that as an egg take source would be on hold.
Interesting. I mean, just to find those fish to begin with is
Yeah.
unusual, and where they came from, still an unknown, I think. This is more of a shoreline issue, and that is there anything riparians can do along their shorelines to make the shells more conducive to fish?
Mhm.
There's a
So,
lot of, I know where I live in Skigamog Point, there's a lot of homes being put up that are knocking down trees and putting in lawns right to the water, and I'm not so sure that's a good idea.
yeah, lawns right to the water's edge always make me cringe. The most important part of a lake is where the shoreline meets the water. We call it the littoral zone. It's where the bulk of all your productivity happens. It's where the majority of your fish spawn. It's where all your nutrient recruitment really happens. When people mow and have these beautiful manicured lawns all the way down to the water's edge, you're opening the potential for increased nutrient loading in a negative manner, especially if you're using excessive, fertilizers and such, or any kind of chemical treatments to eradicate weeds, that sort of thing. All that stuff's going to end up in the lake. And a lot of times people think, well, it's just my yard. I'm not putting chemicals in the lake. Well, at the end of the day, that's where they're going to end up. Wood recruitment's a big thing. When people are cutting down trees along the shorelines, or they're removing things that fall into the lake, that's basically why we've ended up doing the fish habitat, the fish shelter project in the chain that we've had to do. In a natural lake, all that stuff's going to fall in, and over time the lake's going to draw it out into the lake and use it, and by use it, I mean fish are going to use it for habitat. Macroinvertebrates are going to consume it. Algae and small plants and plankton and stuff are going to grow on it and live within it. And eventually it's going to break down and become fully utilized. When you build a ton of houses on a lake and you take away the ability for any of that wood to enter the lake system, your lake kind of starts to become sterile. You're losing fish habitat. You're losing food sources. We call it allochthonous material that bugs and crayfish and all those things, those tiny little things that we maybe don't think about at a lake, they need all that stuff to live in, to live on. So when every little branch that falls in the lake, when people are taking that out, think twice about that. Maybe just put it out in deeper water. If it's in your beach area where your grandkids, your kids play, I know you don't really want it in there, but it can be a hazard. But rather than pitch it up in your fire pit, maybe pitch it out in deeper water. You guys up there are pretty fortunate that you've got a pretty good resource in the Antrim County Conservation District. They've done a number of shoreline protection sites over the years that are really good locations to go take a look at and get ideas from, where Heidi up there at the Conservation District has worked with property owners to do shoreline plantings of native species, really nice, like anything from the wildest looking of shorelines to very manicured looking shorelines. It can all be done with native species and deep rooted species that are not only going to positively contribute to the lake, but they're going to protect your shoreline from erosion too. We're seeing, not necessarily with you guys because you have fairly fixed lake levels, but with a lot of other lakes and the Great Lakes, with our water levels going up and down, we see a ton of permit applications for dredging and seawalls and such. And really, if you take care of your shoreline and let it be a shoreline, you can alleviate a lot of those concerns without having to spend a lot of money and without having to come in and do some kind of unnatural man-made type structures.
Thank you.
Okay. I am curious whether the DNR has taken a hard look at the fish boxes that were permitted in the entire chain of lakes, but especially in Elk Lake.
Yeah, we've definitely been kind of keeping an eye on things. I get a lot of reports from folks, people, especially people who have them on their riparian frontage. It was a really good project in the sense that, for a couple of years after installation, or while installation was still occurring, there was a graduate student on the project who was able to dive on different structures, different locations, and really give us a good sense for what species of fish and what ages of fish were using these different types of structures, how they were being utilized and such. So nowadays I mainly get reports from, like I said, riparians who have those on their frontage, or anglers who are utilizing them pretty heavily. We don't really have the capability to do a ton of habitat monitoring. My crew is pretty small, so we don't have the ability necessarily to go out and dive on those structures and look at how they're decaying or breaking down. So I rely on recreational anglers who are kind of relaying to me what they're catching on them, or folks who do have the ability to snorkel or dive on them and are sending me pictures and such.
The south end of Elk Lake has almost none of those boxes. They're more concentrated in the upper 2/3. Would you entertain the notion of a new round of permits, possibly for Elk Lake, focused on that southern end?
Sure. And for folks that don't know, so it's not a DNR issued permit. It's actually issued through Eagle. However, it's one of those Eagle permits that requires me as the local fisheries biologist to be heavily involved in the design and implementation of the project and to sign off on it. So the project went really well the first time around. Like I said, it's one of the very few habitat projects that I've worked on with a lake association that A, was tremendously large in scale, and B, actually had some follow-up and assessment tied to it. Went really well. I think it would be pretty well received by Eagle as well if Elk Lake wanted to entertain that process again and add some additional structures to the south end of the lake.
One of the things that would address would be our next generation of anglers. As you're probably aware, those structures have been a favorite place for people to take the grandkids. On a very different species, whitefish.
Mm-hmm.
I have heard many stories from people that at one point Elk Lake was just thriving with whitefish, and they were especially targeted in the winter months.
Mm-hmm.
And by the same token, I've heard that sport seems to be disappearing. Do you have any sense of what's going on with that?
I think it's a little bit of two things. On the whole, we see less people in inland lakes that are targeting cisco and whitefish. So you've got kind of that component too. The biggest component is probably comes down to invasive species. And we see this out on Lake Michigan more than anything. So on Lake Michigan, it's definitely declined. And with the kind of boom of cisco, if you will, we've seen more and more people out there who are fishing for corrigonids, for whitefish, for cisco, and doing quite well. But whitefish are on the decline. A lot of that has to do with zebra mussels and the fact that our water is, and this is not just Lake Michigan, but it's our bigger inland lakes too. It's Torch and it's Elk. Historically, they've always been clear, but when you throw zebra mussels in the mix, what plankton and nutrients are in that lake were utilized pretty heavily by those mussels, and now they're locked up on the bottom in these decaying mussels and not available for fish that really need them, like whitefish and cisco. Cisco have done better than whitefish because some of our cisco have converted to piscivory and began eating other fish species. Plankton are still a huge component in whitefish diet. So if you're a fish that's expected to grow to 9, 10, 12 pounds on a diet of plankton, and these zebra mussels have come in and filtered all of your food essentially out of the majority of your water column, it's a lot tougher to survive. It's a lot tougher to reach these more robust sizes. And our inland lake whitefish tend to be a little bit smaller anyways, but they still require a lot of plankton to get to where they need to be. So with these mussel infestations that occurred in the early 90s, we've slowly started to see some declines. And our Great Lakes research has really strongly tied that to declining nutrient levels.
Okay. Well, thank you. Dale.
Hi, Heather. Welcome to our Lake Skegumog fishery. Quite a few bluegills this morning send their regards to you.
Nice.
They're all thrown back in. My passion is fly fishing in the warm waters of south end of Skegumog. So how do you evaluate the status of this fishery for the smallmouth, perch, pike and muskie are a little different than the and the panfish. So how do you evaluate our fishery and how it's doing today?
So luckily, and I would say probably out of the 3 bigger lakes in the chain there, I get the most reports from anglers out of Skegumog. Skegumog definitely has a better ice fishery for a variety of reasons. But I hear a lot from pike and perch guys that fish through the ice. We do see a fair amount of tournaments and open water anglers on Skegumog that are chasing bass and perch, muskie too. So I definitely hear a lot more from anglers that are fishing on Skegumog than I do the other 3 lakes. Ideally, we would get in there and do another survey. It's been a number of years since we've been into survey Skegumog as well. I think it was early 2000s. Actually, in the early 2000s, we did all the lakes in the Antrim chain from top to bottom, from the teeniest, tiniest, Benway, Hanley, Scotts Lake area, all the way down through Elk and Torch and Skeg. I'm trying to kind of pick away and do those again. Back then we had enough crew and resources that we were able to survey the entire chain, I think in 3 seasons. We were able to do Torch in 2018. And so my plan is to get to Elk and Skegumog eventually too. That's really our best way to get in and do a full evaluation where we can get in with various types of nets, electrofishing equipment, seines, and take a look at things from top to bottom. So we haven't been in Skegumog Lake for quite some time. But like I mentioned, I think it's out of all the 3 bigger lakes at the bottom there, that's definitely the one that I hear from folks about the most. I think it's been pretty solid. It's had some ups and downs. Every couple of years, I get some complaints about the perch fishery, which is fairly typical for a good perch lake that gets a lot of pressure. Skegumog has great perch habitat, so reproduction is strong, but it gets a lot of folks that like to target perch. And your locations to target perch are pretty slim, especially in the wintertime. So you get a lot of congregation of fish, you get a lot of people on top of them. You can burn through bigger size fish pretty quickly. But again, we've got a ton of good spawning habitat for perch in that lake, and they do very, very well. So perch are one that we tend to be pretty cyclical. I hear lots of good things about the panfish fishery, bluegill and sunfish in particular. I don't get a ton of complaints. I get a few people that complain about rock bass from time to time, but those seem to be pretty big and fat and healthy too. So
Worm thieves.
Yeah. The smallmouth fishery seems very, very stable. I talk to a lot of guys that really hone in on Skegumog as their go-to fall fishery and do very, very well. Muskie, of course, muskie is one of the most targeted fish in Skegumog, and that's been fairly consistent for what it is. The muskie population in the chain is a pretty delicate one. We don't stock it. It's self-sustaining and it's pretty low, but it's got a ton of big fish in it, and that stayed pretty stable over time too. So I'm pretty happy with where Skagamog is at. It's definitely on my radar down the road to get in there and survey, though. We'll do elk first, and kind of tie it in. It's because it's most closely related to torch. I want to do elk in a timely manner so that our work in torch is fairly comparable to it. Skagamog's a whole different type of lake, so we'll do that one a couple years down the road.
One of the things we saw this spring was that because the water warmed up slowly, when we had opening day, there were boats stacked up like cordwood sitting on top of beds.
Yeah.
That can't be good for the fishery.
No, and I'm actually doing some work with our Charlevoix Research Station staff and CMU graduate and undergraduate students. We're doing some smallmouth bass evaluations out on Lake Michigan and looking at potentially changing regulations out there. The Beaver Island Archipelago is a good example of this. We have a delayed harvest season where you can't harvest or possess fish. You can do catch and release, but you can't harvest or possess fish until July 1. And we've seen some pretty positive changes over the 20 years that regulation's been in place. So no firm traction on this yet, but we are looking at some of our bigger, deeper, colder northern bodies of water where our spawn tends to occur later than a lot of our downstate lakes do, for that very reason, because there are some there are some negative impacts that occur when you're, I mean, let's face it, opening weekend is probably our busiest bass weekend, and when it occurs smack dab in the middle of spawning, when all these fish are up on beds, it's tough on a population. Varies from year to year, but it's still kind of tough on a population. So that is something we're keeping an eye on.
Thank you. Yeah, that we'd be in support of that.
Ken.
Okay, I have one more kind of a big general topic about money. Let's talk about the DNR's funding sources. It looks like today the DNR gets about 70% of its budget from the state in the form of licenses, hunting and fishing licenses. About 70%, excuse me, about 17% comes from the federal government from excise taxes, and only about 11% from the general fund. Now, 20, 30 years ago, we used to get, I believe, somewhere in the range of 50% from the general fund. The general fund was giving a lot more money to the DNR, and that dwindled away over 20, 30 years, I think it was. So I really have three questions for you around that. Has there been any talk of restoring a greater percentage of money coming from the general fund? And quite frankly, I would hugely be in support of that. After all, when I think of the natural resources of Michigan, it's certainly one of the reasons why all five of us here are here, and most people are here, are the natural resources. And a lot of natural resources, of course, the conservation of that is a responsibility of DNR. And it's really sad to me to see that portion dwindle down so much to literally almost nothing. So that was the first question. The second question was the budget shortfall over the next couple of years because of COVID. That's certainly going to hurt you too. Maybe you can talk about that for a second. And then thirdly, what else can people do? The general public, ESLA, what else can people do to support your activities?
Wow, you had to end with a pretty heavy question there, Ken.
Got any ideas?
Oh gosh. We're going to start on this one. So we're probably not looking at getting more general fund money, and even pre-COVID, I would say that too. We're actually looking to figure out ways to get more funding or match kind of at the federal level instead. I don't know, some of you have probably heard of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. That's a big one that we're working through right now, where, unfortunately, natural resources is kind of a pay-to-play sort of situation. really our ability to do work falls on the backs of the people who are benefiting from our work. It's kind of it's a big loop there, basically. So most of our money comes in the form of reimbursements, and that's the federal portion, and direct payments from our game and fish fund, which is license sales. The general dollar, and I will say the 11% that comes from the general fund, Fish Division doesn't see very much of it. Fish Division doesn't own a whole lot of land. We aren't doing first responder type work. Excuse me. So a lot of that 11% goes to payments in lieu of taxes on state land. It goes to law enforcement. It goes to kind of our general type of operations, not necessarily things like fish stocking or habitat work or survey work. That's all pretty much licensed dollars, and then federal match on those licensed dollars, or Pittman-Robertson Act monies. That's the excise tax that comes in. So so our ability to really do the work that we do is hugely dependent upon folks buying fishing licenses. And that's, at this point in time, that's the biggest thing. People are always like, oh, you know, how can we get a lot of folks who maybe are looking to, and I'm not going to say a lot. We get some folks who say, man, you know, I'd really like to give you some money to help the cause. And we aren't really set up, because we're the government, to take donations in that respect. But the easiest thing people can do to help us out is simply buy a fishing license. You know, if you're a Michigan resident, it's $26. We get that money. That money goes directly to our coffers. It helps raise our numbers. We get more federal reimbursement money back. So we get school teachers who will do fundraiser campaigns to buy their entire classroom a license, or we get sportsmen's groups who will buy, you know, big groups of people licenses and do a group fishing outing for a retirement home, or for you know, some schools or summer camps or those sorts of things. That's really the best way to kind of help us out, is to take someone fishing. Take someone fishing who doesn't go fishing maybe more than once a year, and buy them an annual license as a gift. Get someone who's on the fence about, man, you know, I'd really like to learn how to fly fish, or man, muskie fishing looks really cool, or I love to eat yellow perch in a restaurant. You know, maybe I could go catch them on my own. Convince them to do it. You know, take them out there, teach them, buy them a license. That's probably the best way, the most effective way, the quickest way to help us gain some ground and to get some funding. We, with the pandemic, I've been working at home since, I think, May 23rd, and I probably will be until next May 23rd, at least, by the sounds of things. So we've had to do some pretty significant budget cuts. We're saving some money not having people in offices. We're not really excited about saving money that way. But we have had to do some layoffs. I think all of us that work for Fish Division have been laid off at some level during this summer, spring and summer. So our budget for this year looks pretty good. We unfortunately were not able to do our steelhead, walleye, or muskie egg takes. So we're not raising any of those fish in our hatchery system right now. That's another unfortunate cost savings. So headed into fiscal year 2021, we're going to close out fiscal year 20 in pretty good shape. 2021 looks interesting. There's a ton of unknowns. This spring, our license sales were down, of course, because people weren't leaving their home. We had a little debacle with use of motorboats at some point in time. So that discouraged some fishing, but we've gained. We were having a meeting with our chief last week, and fishing license sales are actually up over this point in time last year. I think the one kind of inadvertent blessing, if you will, that's come out of this pandemic is I see a ton more people outside. Whether they're kayaking, fishing, hiking, there's a lot of people who are getting out and about and distancing that way and taking advantage of the outdoors. So that's been kind of a nice thing to see. But there's a lot of uncertainty with our budget for 2021 and certainly for 2022 too. It's just all going to kind of hinge on what happens in the next few months. But the fact that license sales are up is pretty encouraging. That will definitely be very helpful.
Good. One quick question on that. You mentioned the Pittman-Robertson Act, and most people probably are not familiar with that and how much money it brings into the federal government and is redistributed to us. Can you tell us briefly the history and what it collects money from?
Sure. So there's and actually that it's a really cool setup. There's the Pittman and Robertson Act, and then there's the Dingell-Johnson Act. Dingell-Johnson does the exact same thing, but on the hunting side. So Pittman-Robertson basically is an excise tax on goods that you and I pay without even really kind of realizing it. So let's say you decide you want a new 9.5 horse kicker for your trolling boat. So you go buy a new Mercury 9.5 horse motor. You're going to pay an excise tax on that. That goes into the Pittman-Robertson pool. I go and I buy 10 new trolling spoons. There's a slight tax on that. That goes into the Pittman-Robertson fund. At the end of the year, all that stuff is broken down by state, and that's the federal reimbursement part of the federal reimbursement that comes to us. Some of the federal reimbursement is based on license sales. The rest of it is from this excise tax. So that money comes back to us, comes back to the state, and it goes into our game and fish fund and can be only used for game and fish type projects. So only used for fish stocking, only used to support my staff and our survey work, those sorts of things. It's not money that can be reallocated back to the general fund. You know, another division or the government, the state government itself can't necessarily take that money back and put it in the general coffers and use it for road repairs or any of those sorts of things. That is money that was spent by sportsmen on goods and services to benefit their outdoor recreation. And so that money is specifically allocated to be used for fish and game related projects. And that's been a really consistent way for funding to come down to states to support activities like fisheries management and wildlife management.
Good, thank you.
I am going to take license as the moderator to ask a final question, because one of the things that's really important to us is that you renew our prescription when it comes up on those trout. So tell us, if somebody new to fishing for brown trout in a lake like Elk, season, time of day, depths, how should they go fish for them?
So I'll segue first and kind of explain how that, because you mentioned the prescription, I'll bring that up. So whenever we stock a lake, it gets a prescription. And that prescription is a living document. It's good for 6 years. And so what that document does is I have to lay out my plan. So I have to lay out how many fish I'm going to stock, how often I'm going to do it, what the justification is, what the cost breakdowns are, and how it's going to benefit the lake. That document then gets peer reviewed. If the other biologists that I work with support it, it gets approved, and then we're good to go for 6 years. So I wrote that document in 19. So we're good through let's see. It's good through 2024. I think I wrote it in 18. But in order to support that document, that's where I need reports from people, because I have to have that justification. So if I'm getting pictures and even just quick email blasts like, hey, I trolled for 3 hours today. I caught 1 brown trout, a smallmouth, and a white sucker. Like, that's good information for me to have. Brown trout in inland lakes have a tendency to relate fairly heavily to what we call the thermocline, which is where the temperature break is. Most people do really well trolling small spoons or body baits. Things like Rapalas, super slim trolling spoons, which are they're like a 3-inch long spoon. that has a little bit more action to them, right? They're very thin, they're very short. We kind of call them, everybody wants to call them flutter spoons. You can be as simple as flatlining a couple of rods behind your boat. You could be as complicated as running 1 and 2 colors of lead off of planer boards or off of downriggers on your boat. Brown trout are kind of one of those fish that you can be as fancy or as plain as you really want to be. Most people troll for them. You can cast for them, but you've got to have the right conditions. They can be a little finicky in that regard. But it really just takes a little bit of time. Elk Lake's a big lake, so it's helpful to go out and troll around for a while. Pay attention to when you hit fish. Pay attention to how fast your boat is going. A lot of folks make the mistake of trolling too fast or too slow. Do some reading. Brown trout are a little bit different from rainbow trout, but you do still want to troll moderately fast, a little over 2 miles an hour. With our phones and the GPS systems that we put on our boats now, it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to track ground speed at least, and you're not trolling brown trout super deep. So you can use your ground speed pretty reliably. It's not the exact same speed that your lure is going, but you can be pretty close. Pay attention to things like speed, pay attention to temperature. Get a good fish graph where you can, clearly see where fish are relating to structure, relating to temperature, and just get out there and do it. Mornings and evenings are typically best. They are a little bit light sensitive, but again, Elk Lake is deep, so you've got opportunities to target. If you really want to challenge yourself, you've got opportunities to target deeper water fish too. But the big thing is really just to get out there. Every boat fishes differently and every angler fishes differently. So it can be a little bit discouraging at first. And remember, we've got 3 groups of fish in there right now. They're really not going to start, the first batch really isn't going to start contributing to that fishery until probably next year. So it's going to be a little bit slow to start. Really, probably 2022 and 2023 are when we really should see these fish be in pretty good catchable numbers. So take the time to get out there now and figure out how fast your boat trolls. Figure out how to read thermocline and brakes and stuff on your graphs and such. Figure out, what works best for you. There are plenty of rainbows out there. There are some browns, some wild browns and stuff too. Smallmouth, you control smallmouth pretty effectively. So it's not to say that you're not going to catch anything because those browns aren't quite big enough yet. Just get out there and practice and figure out what works best for you. Again, brown trout they're pretty voracious feeders. They don't need giant gear. A 6 or 7 inch Rapala, moderate diving, body baits work really well. Those flutter spoons with a ton of action work really well. So just get out and see how that stuff works behind your boat and get some practice in. It's really the best way to do it.
Okay. Well, we really appreciate your time. I know we've been trying to get you in front of the ESLA people for the last couple of years, and we decided we just wouldn't be daunted by the pandemic, and I hope lots of people click on this and listen to your words of wisdom about our lakes.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm glad we were able to pull this together, and I certainly appreciate chatting with you guys and being able to talk with you and spend some time today.
Okay. Thanks
Thanks,
again.
Heather.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Tight line.
Thank you, Heather.